In this lecture, we're going to move our enemies to the beginning of the patrol path. I'm viewing the map from an aerial view. The paths are not aligned with the enemy's current position. Before we can patrol the path, the enemy must sit on the path. There are two solutions for putting the enemies on the path. The first solution would be to move the objects above one another. This solution can work, but it can be a tedious process. We must be precise with our positioning. Otherwise, we may get jittery movement. The second solution is to use code. Rather than performing this process manually, we should use code to help us move the enemy to the beginning of the path. After they've arrived at the beginning of the path, they will begin the patrol behavior. I think this solution is the best way to go. Let's get started. In Visual Studio Code, open the enemy controller file. Our first step is to grab a reference to the patrol component. This component will be responsible for handling most of the patrol logic. At the top of the class, define a new public variable called patrol component. Its type will be the patrol class. Next, add the non-serialized attribute to prevent the field from being modified by the Unity editor. After adding the variable, we should grab the component from the awake method. In this method, set the patrol component variable to the getComponentPatrol method. After referencing the components, we can begin moving the enemy to the path. Let's do so from the return state. Currently, the enemy returns to its original position. However, if they have the ability to patrol, they should return to the patrol path instead of their original location. We'll use the return state for handling this logic. First, we should check if the enemy can patrol. In the enterState method, add a conditional statement with the following condition: enemy.patrolComponent $!null. We're using a comparison operator called not equal to. The condition will check if the patrol variable has a value. If it does, this means the character has patrol capabilities. We should always check for the component before initiating patrolling behavior. But what if the enemy can't patrol? Let's add an else block. Move the moveDestination method into this block of code. If the enemy can't patrol, the default behavior should be able to return to their original position. The next step is to create a method for grabbing a position from the path. We'll create this method from the patrol class. Currently, we don't know where the path begins. Luckily, the splines package has dozens of methods for helping us grab this location. Before we can use these methods, we should include the namespace for the spline package. At the top of the file, add the unityengine.splines namespace. Adding this namespace is crucial. Otherwise, it may be challenging to use the methods from Unity. Next, let's grab a reference to the spline component attached to the game object. This component will have the methods for communicating with the current spline. At the top of the class, define a private variable called spline component. The type will be spline container. Typically, the name of the component would be the name of the class. However, the Unity team uses a different name for the class. It's called spline container. After creating the variable, define the awake method. We'll initialize the variables from this method. Set the spline component variable to the spline game object .getComponentSpline container method. Our component is ready. It has all the information it needs to access the spline. There's one thing worth noting about this line of code. We're calling the getComponent method from the spline game object. As a reminder, the spline is on a completely different object. The patrol component is attached to the enemy, which doesn't have the spline component. Therefore, we're grabbing the component from a different object, which is allowed. Typically, we would grab components from the same game object. However, It's completely acceptable to grab components from other game objects. Let's start defining a method for grabbing a position from the spline. Below the awake method, define a public method called getNextPosition. The return type will be a vector. Return the following value: spline component dot evaluate position 0. The spline component has a method called evaluatePosition. This method grabs a specific point from the current spline. We can pass in a number from 0 to 1. 0 refers to the start of the path. 1 refers to the end of a path. If we were to pass in 0.5, we would be returned to a point in the middle of the path. After grabbing the point, Unity returns the position as a vector. By default, this method will always return the same position. In the future, this method will be modified to return a dynamic path. For now, this solution is acceptable. Let's call this method from the return state to get the point. The position will be stored in a variable for the class. In a future lecture, we're going to transition into a different state after the enemy has arrived at its destination. Without storing the destination, we won't be able to verify the enemy has arrived at its desired position. At the top of the class, create a vector variable called targetPosition. Next, inside the if statement, set the targetPosition variable to the enemy.patrolComponent.getNextPosition method. Lastly, call the enemy.movementComponent.moveAgentByDestination method with the targetPosition variable. That should do it. If the enemy has patrolling behavior, they will move to the start of the path. Otherwise, they will remain in their current location. Let's test our code. Head on over to Unity. For this demonstration, we will put the scene and game windows side by side. It'll be easier to view the enemies with the scene window. This way, we do not need to move around the map. Let's try playing the game. As you can see, the patrol guards move to the start of the path. As for the stationary guard, it remains in its original position. That's great. We've successfully moved the enemies to their patrol paths. The next step is to move them along the path.